Okay, so as we're picking up from Sunday, I want to ask a question about the material that we covered. So if the disciples had claimed that Jesus rose from the dead and they went back to their regular lives, would that cause any doubts for you? If the disciples claimed that Jesus rose from the dead and then they went back to their regular lives, fishing, making tents, whatever it was, would that cause any doubts for you?
Doubts about whether they believed in the resurrection or doubts about themselves and what they should do?
I guess either. Just whatever it would present in your mind. Courtney, you've got your hand up.
I think it would cause doubt, just because, this whole time that they were with Jesus, they were preaching these different things than what they were living before they met him. So ultimately, if everything happened and then they went back to their lives, I personally feel like I would look at that and go, well, it didn't matter to them, so why would it matter to me?
Okay, yeah. I had not thought about that. So Courtney said that it would cause doubts for her. And essentially because what Jesus taught the disciples changed their lives. It changed the way that they looked at the world. And so for them to take what Jesus taught and then essentially abandon it and just go back to, as we said, business as usual, would say, well, obviously it wasn't that important. And so it shouldn't be that important to us either, if that's the way they're thinking about it. I think that's a good one I hadn't thought about. Anybody else want to share any doubts that it would maybe bring? Or maybe you wouldn't have any doubts? Bryce.
I think it would definitely be a cause for pause. To maybe investigate it more thoroughly and really with a little more, a little more skeptical eye. For some of the same reasons that Courtney was talking about. If this message that they preached about the importance of this man really didn't have an impact on them, then does that bring into question the truth of it? Or is there something else underlying their reasons for not changing? And I think we see the same thing. People do the same kind of thing with us. They hear about this Christianity thing and this Jesus, and then sometimes because we don't reflect it in our own lives, they doubt and question. And it doesn't change the truth of the message that we don't always act like we should. But it certainly does cause them occasion for questioning how serious can this really be if it doesn't really have an impact on you?
Right. Yeah, I think those would be natural questions. Great.
There was a short fiction book written by the author of maybe Dilbert. It was this strange cartoon that dropped out. He stopped making the cartoon, but he was pretty famous for some pretty strange observations. But in this short story, or novel, he wrote, there was an old man who confronted a young man on his belief. And his argument was, most people who call themselves Christians really aren't Christians, because if they truly believe this is the Son of God, they wouldn't live the way they do. And I support Courtney's observation. This should change our lives. And I think, if nothing else, just the heightened emotional impact this has and trying to figure it out. I don't know if I said it in class or somewhere recently that I think I would have been one that would have been a little hesitant to change my mind about Jesus raising from the dead. I think it would have taken, I don't make quick decisions usually. And I think I would have been a very skeptical individual, and it just would have been heart-wrenching to try to figure all that out. So okay. Yeah, I think people's lives ought to change.
Yeah, absolutely. Ashley.
And I think they took it a step further in that they couldn't help but share the gospel. And I think that is a part that we sometimes lack is, in our lives will be changed, but when it comes to sharing it, we're lacking there. And so if we really believe that we are truly forgiven and we are truly going to go to heaven, why are we not sharing that?
Yeah, absolutely. They could not help but talk about what they had seen and heard, and I thought what you said reminded me of what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5, for the love of Christ controls us, or some of our versions will say compels us. Because we have concluded this, that one has died for all, and therefore all have died. And he died for all, that those who live might no longer live for themselves, but for him who for their sake died and was raised. And I think that's part of what sums up what we're saying, is that message should cause some kind of transformation, and that's what we're talking about with the disciples, because as we said, they could have said all of these things and said, yeah, we really believe this and preached it, but then if we looked at their lives and it didn't have any actual impact, it would raise some questions. And so as we've been talking about, in starting, what did they do after they claimed to see Jesus raised? They were completely different than they had been before. And so we talked about Peter last class as really a core example of that. Can somebody sort of summarize for us the changes that we looked at in Peter? Who was he before and who was he later? Let's get somebody from this side. There's fewer in numbers, but somebody summarize, what was the change that happened in Peter? And you can reference the bottom of page 4 if you want a little bit of a cheat sheet.
I think at first Peter was a little bit skeptic about Jesus and the Christ, but then after he was really converted, he was one of the stronger ones to let Christ's light show forth in him.
Right. He was quite a character, and yeah, he was a little timid at times, but yeah, he does become really sort of the foremost spokesman, at least in the Jewish context, among all the apostles. Like we said, if you look at Peter and what's presented about him in the Gospels, we pointed out specifically he hides and doesn't want to be associated with Jesus when Jesus is on trial before the Jewish council. Denying that he knows Jesus 3 times and swearing, I don't even know this guy that you're talking about. And then when we get to Acts chapter 3 and 4, he's speaking publicly about Jesus and the resurrection. And then he stands trial in front of those very same men that condemned Jesus to death. And he holds true to the testimony and says, you cannot stop me from saying this. And that is a huge thing. That is a big transformation. And so then as we start looking at these and the change in the disciples in general, we got to start asking, okay, what caused this? We, of course, already have our answer to that. We start asking, okay, what is it that caused such a change in these people? Let's move to page number 5, if we don't have anything else that we want to bring up about that. And we mentioned this a little bit, but I want to talk about it explicitly. I think we talked about it. So we said that the change that happened in the disciples, first thing to note is that the Gospels, and even to a certain extent Acts and the epistles too, there's still some instances there, record very honestly the faults and foibles, I think I've heard it said before, of the disciples. That they were ignorant, that they sometimes sinned, that they were jealous of each other. They even abandoned Jesus, and that they doubted what he said, and they disagreed with what he said sometimes. And all of that is recorded. So then the question that we need to ask is, why would that be made up? Is there any chance that that would be made up? So, as I said at the top of that page, they do not at all avoid recording and depicting those faults. And so I asked this question more in the paragraph, would there be any incentive to making up details like this about the leaders of the movement? If you're trying to promote your movement and get more people to follow it, would you want to portray your leaders as weak, sinful, ignorant people? No. And as we talked about in previous classes, this is known as sort of the criterion of embarrassment, sometimes called, of if you're including details that embarrass you, then it's more likely that you're telling the truth. And so one person states this as, people do not make up lies in order to hurt themselves, they lie to help themselves. And that's basically the point. That there's nothing that could explain why, if we're saying this isn't true, why on earth would these people make up these details? About these same leaders that were over them, right? And so that is a question that somebody would need to answer if we're putting forward an objection to the truthfulness of this. Does anybody want to comment on that? I want to talk about it as it comes up throughout the class, but I didn't have any questions. Bruce?
It's kind of an important hallmark of Scripture, too, that differentiates it from some other religious literature, is that frequently changes within the leadership, things that were previously sinful, require a new revelation that at least the prophet or others are permitted to do those kinds of things.
Right.
Scripture doesn't do that. It doesn't alter the truth to fit the circumstance with regard to its leaders and the people who are revealing it, because they're not really the focus in the first place. So it is a distinction that is pretty clear if you've investigated other religious literature.
There's usually a pretty predictable pattern with a lot of that too.
There is.
Not necessarily getting into all the details, but it's usually, oh, I'm the only source of truth, and then you can't talk to anybody else, and oh, by the way, we can have multiple wives, and actually all your wives are mine, and you see that. In like every case, that's things that happen like that, and you're right. It's made up to give the leaders what they want. I think Ashley and then Andrew.
It's about something that Andrew said, so yeah, talking over him. But one time he was talking about how typically in history even, we will do something called whitewashing, where we
Yeah.
only talk about, the positive things or whatever, and this is the complete opposite of that.
Yeah, including all of it. The good, the bad, the ugly. Andrew.
I was trying to think of maybe one, if you were arguing from the other side of things, a justification you could put forward as to why you might tell these details. I mean, the thing I could think of is if it was an attempt to exaggerate the testimony, and these leaders of the church kind of give themselves a checkered past so that the contrast of their conversion is more impactful. I mean, you can imagine that maybe a preacher talks up how rough they were in their youth, so that then it kind of sells the point of how they live today. But the problem with that argument, I think, is the Bible continues to record their embarrassing details even after they were leaders of the church. Peter went on to be prejudiced against people who were included in the kingdom and had to be reprimanded for that. So it wasn't just well, I used to be this way, but now we're all mature and have it all figured out. The embarrassment continued even after they took upon leadership in the church.
Yeah, absolutely. It's we're still like this, and it's not about us, it's about the message. Absolutely. Somebody else here.
Well, I think that just solidifies the fact that the simplicity of it, that the leaders of the church are still followers of Jesus. And Jesus is the only one that's set apart as, perfect. He's the one set apart as the one that strive to. And when the leaders show their humanity, it makes them more relatable.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because if they have this, if they're always up on a pedestal, well, that's because they're the leaders, and we can't ever do that. But when you see them stumble, it provides more hope and more community.
Yeah, they don't really point to themselves, they point to Jesus. And even when Paul says, imitate me, it's because I'm imitating Jesus. And it's not based on them. Okay. So going to the next step, so we've talked about the fact that they were completely different, and they go so far as not only to say different things and do different things, but they suffer, and many of them become martyrs. So that's what we're going to talk about next. The suffering and the martyrdom of the apostles. So as we've been talking about, The apostles suffered, the original disciples suffered. Even those who join the church later start to suffer and join in some of that. And some of them die. We see that really early on. You know, Stephen is that first recorded one. And then one of the apostles dies a couple chapters later. And this was because, as we pointed out, their persecution and their suffering, as we went through the book of Acts in the first couple of classes, was because they were proclaiming that Jesus had risen from the dead. That was kind of the center of the whole thing. Now, we don't have record of any one of them going back on that claim. There's not a single record out there of any one of them saying, oh, actually, we just made it up. Or actually, I don't believe that anymore. It's nowhere to be found. They remained completely resolute in what they were saying, even until the very end. When many of them were tortured and killed, when they were arrested and put in front of world powers and local leaders and everything in between, they were resolute in still staying with this belief. And so I made some mention too about some of these martyrdom records. So some of them are pretty debated historically as to how relatable it is, because we have stories of, I don't remember which it is, but I think maybe it's like Bartholomew going to India and getting burned alive or things like that. And it's not clear how reliable those are, but ones that are reliable, Peter, James, and Paul. And pretty much everyone agrees, yes, those are historically bedrock things. And I would add to that the martyrdom of James, the brother of John, in chapter 12. Why don't we turn there real quick, Acts chapter 12, because this is really the first one out of the apostles here. So this is, of course, after all of the fallout happens from the execution of Stephen and then the persecution that opens up and scatters the church early in those days. Can we get someone to read Acts chapter 12, verses 1 through 3? Acts 12, 1 through 3. Courtney.
Just to check, can everybody hear me if I talk?
No.
Louder?
Yeah.
About the time that Herod the king laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church, he killed James, the brother of John, with a sword. When he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. This was during the days of unleavened bread.
Okay, so to put it sort of cruelly, I guess, Stephen gets killed, but he's not one of the core leaders, right? And so you could say, he was just sort of some random guy that was executed. But the movement can still keep going on. But once the core apostles start getting arrested and executed, that's different, right? If we're just thinking from purely human standards of, what happens when someone who's maybe not as important gets taken out, but then when one of the leaders gets taken out, it's a totally different thing. So if, number 1 on page 5, if the disciples were faking this story, what probably would have happened once some of them started being arrested and killed?
The others would have begun to recant.
Yeah, I don't want to go through that. James, the brother of John, was one of the original ones, and yeah.
I think they would be more secretive, more maybe not as public as they were.
Yeah, so taking it sort of more privately and kind of, you can think of like a house-to-house sort of deal instead of staying out and publicly proclaiming. And of course, he kills James, the brother of John, one of the original ones, and then he arrests Peter also. And so you can imagine the church is thinking, oh no, you're going to get both of them. Salem, what were you going to say?
The way that I kind of answered this was we kind of know what they would have done because they did it when Jesus died. And although they weren't making it up, they thought they were wrong.
Yeah.
And so they probably would have denied it and they would have hidden and they didn't do any of that. And so to have the record of what they did before and then what they're doing now in the face of
hadn't really thought of that connection. So what Salem said is, we have an exact situation like this that happened before when Jesus was arrested. And what happened when Jesus was arrested is they all scattered and hid and denied that they were associated with him or that they even knew him. And so if you're reading this for the first time, going through the Gospels and now you're in Acts, you would assume, okay, this is the same situation. What's probably going to happen is they're all going to start running and hiding again and denying the whole thing. But that's not what happens, is it? Because if they were faking the whole thing, right, or if they didn't understand, like in the case of what was going on with Jesus, even if they just didn't understand, you would assume that they would just go back on and say, I don't want to die for this. But that's not what they do. Andrew.
Okay, so this is something I heard, and I'd like to get people's thoughts on it.
Oh, great.
I heard an argument actually pretty recently with someone who was not a believer, but the argument was made that the message of Christianity evolved when persecution shifted from coming from the Jews to coming from Rome. And when the persecution arose from Rome, they argued that during that period of time, the gospel letters that were written during that time de-emphasized the role of Rome in killing Jesus and began to inflate the role of the Jews in killing Jesus. Because persecution of Jews and Christians was rising, and the argument was that Christianity decided to take a sidestep and let the Jews take more of the blame. That was the argument made there. So I guess one of the things we might say is, would they have softened the message or tried to amend the message to appease whoever were their oppressors at the time and get the pressure off of them? And what do we say to those kinds of claims that the Gospels or the message, they allowed it to be altered to spare them some of the heat?
So I would ask, what do you say first? Curious about, because you have had time to think about it, obviously.
Well, I just remembered hearing about it, and I haven't had a lot of time to fully think about it yet.
Yeah. Does anybody just dying to jump in on that before I say anything? No.
I feel like the Gospels pretty equally distribute the blame. Clearly the Jews were the ones responsible for arresting him and bringing him to trial.
Sort of initiating it.
But there is on no occasion in any of it a dismissal of the fact that Rome had a role to play in it. If nobody else, certainly Pontius Pilate and Herod. And so he was unjustly put to death by the Jews at the hands of the Gentiles, which was the Roman Empire at that time. So, even Acts 2, where the first gospel sermon's preached, it's pretty much both statements are made that according to the foreknowledge of God, you delivered him over and had him put to death by the hands of these godless men. And so, clearly the Jews are the focal point, but I don't know that. I think it's begging the question to say that it happened because there was an alteration of the gospel message on the basis of Roman persecution, when the reality is that a significant portion of the scriptures as a whole are Jewish focused because of their role in the plan. So, is that a possible explanation? Yeah, that they shifted the blame to kind of take the pressure off. Sure, that's a plausible explanation. Does it make the most sense with regard to the information we have? I don't know. I think it's a reach.
Yeah. Andrew.
We do know from history that the church, and this is talking about several hundred years after the time of Christ, but it is true from history that Christianity, as it was viewed globally, did take the path of sort of embracing that anti-Semitism. It did become a hallmark of the organized church, in the 600s, 700s
else dying to get in on this. Okay, so part of why I had them talk first is I'm really bad on the spot and I have to think about things for a little bit. And so I have sort of two thoughts that I was thinking. So first is, and I got to remember 1, 2. Okay, which one is which? The first one is the fact that, as Brace talked about, it's begging the question because it's assuming something already being there that's not there. And what I mean by that is there's no evidence that that happened. It's just not there. There's no evidence of the tampering. And so part of what we're doing in going to the earliest record that we have, say in 1 Corinthians 15, is we said that this was constructed, this record of the core gospel and teaching was recorded within 10 years at most to when the events happened. And what we know historically is that is not enough time for something legendary or that kind of embellishment to happen. It just does not happen that fast. There's no record of that actually occurring anywhere. And so really the first thing would be onus on whoever's making that objection to come up with the evidence that they're suggesting is there, because it doesn't exist. The second one is, I don't think that the New Testament at all softens the message of Jesus against the Roman Empire. Because if we understand the New Testament in the context of the first century, to say that Jesus was Lord in Christ meant that he was a threat to the Roman Empire. It was viewed initially as inherently political. And there are very clear cases, especially if you look at the book of Revelation, for instance, where Jesus is very clearly being put forward as the one and only true God over and against even the Roman emperor who called themselves God. So the New Testament is not softening the attack on the Romans at all. The Jews are the focus, right? Because as was said, they are the people of God and the plan of God, and most of the early church started that way as Jewish heritage. But it doesn't deaden the attack at all if we understand the New Testament in its first century context. It's very critical of the empire and of the government. So those are my thoughts. Hopefully they came forward coherently. Okay, so, and then thinking about this next question, as we just talked about number 1, and I guess tonight is the night of addressing objections, because I had one that I had prepared. So, in looking at the fact of if the disciples were faking the story, they probably would have recanted or stepped away from the message once they started being arrested and killed. It could also be objected that the Christians wouldn't have allowed any record of one of the original disciples turning away to survive. You know, to say, okay, well, they were trying to control the narrative, and so if one of them did step away, then the church was going to make sure that that didn't get out. And I could see that as being a pretty likely objection. But what I want to bring up about that is, what about Judas? So if you think about Judas, Judas is discussed without hesitation, very bluntly, in all of the things that he was doing, and the fact that Jesus picked him himself. Jesus picked Judas. And what the Gospels reveal is, under Jesus' own nose, of course I think he knew this, Judas was taking money out of the bag for himself. He was plotting against the leader. Isn't that embarrassing to Jesus and to his followers? But that's not whitewashed or bowled over at all. Wouldn't that be embarrassing enough? So if the early church recorded the downfall of one of the original disciples whom Jesus picked in Judas, there doesn't seem to be any good reason that they wouldn't have recorded that elsewhere. I think that goes along with some of what we're talking about. Again, as we see, the Gospels seem to tell it like it is. They don't embellish. They don't shy away from the ugly details. They just tell it like it is. But we need to get to something else, number 2 here. Does the fact that the disciples sincerely believed by itself, does the fact that the disciples sincerely believed they saw Jesus alive again mean that what they said was true? Does their claiming to see Jesus alive again and actually believing that mean that that was actually true? Joy.
If I understand the question correctly, it doesn't mean that because lots of people sincerely believe
Yeah.
lots of things, and it doesn't make them right.
Okay. Well, what about the fact that they died for it?
There's
No.
other religions that people died in.
Right. So the fact that the disciples sincerely believed does not prove that the message of Christianity is true. And what Joy said is correct, I think. For instance, what about an Islamic terrorist? Or the Nazis? Or some kind of political revolutionary that, dies for a cause? Does anybody question that they're sincere in their belief? But in a lot of those cases, obviously that was a generalization with the political revolutionary. But with religious terrorism and with the Nazis and things, people who died for a sincere belief on something, do we say that they're correct even though they were sincere? No. So as we're talking about what we're saying with the sincere belief of the disciples is we're talking about information that everyone can agree on because it's the historical bedrock. But that does not prove that what they said was true. Of course, we think there are other reasons for the fact that what they said was true. But we need to differentiate that just showing that they were sincere does not prove the gospel of Jesus. Because that's a jump that I think we would be likely to make, and it would be a wrong jump. What do we think about that? Objections, questions? Great.
When someone has a sincere belief, it's usually to their perceived advantage to maintain that in the face of facts that are contrary to their belief system. So those who may have political power by their martyrdom they're vested, and they're going to see it through because to recant at that point is going to cause them much more suffering and harm at the hand of their compatriots than recanting and switching views. They will be killed and they will be weeded out and they will be trampled for having even questioning of that which they committed themselves to sincerely, even though it was wrong. And to the apostles' case, everything would have gone to their advantage if they recanted.
Yeah.
It's the complete opposite. They were poor, they were hunted, they were mistreated, they were imprisoned, they were beaten, and et cetera, et cetera. Everything about their life on this planet would have got better if they recanted. And that's not the case with these other examples of sincere conviction, or once you're in, you stay in because the cost of getting out is higher than the cost of staying in, even to the point of death.
Right, yeah. We're going to talk about that more later too. But the disciples, they had every incentive not to continue with this message. And I think they could have walked away with it because if we understand it historically, there had been other messiahs who had popped up and claimed to be the chosen one. And they were killed, and then their followers just dispersed and everybody left them alone. I think the apostles could have done that, but they didn't. And they instead went in the face of all of the incentives that they had to stop, and they rejected those things, and they kept going. So they were sincere, yeah.
It goes back to what I think Gamaliel said in Acts chapter 2. If this is of man, it will die. If this is of God, we can't stop it. And, the apostles, their belief drove the emotion, and the emotions drove their actions, but it doesn't make it factual.
Right.
Just because you believe it and that emotion of believing it, there's a story of a car crash and two really similar females. One died, one's in the hospital. They got them flip-flopped. Well, the family that buried the child, theirs was still alive in the hospital. They felt the devastation of loss, and the one whose child actually died felt the hope of recovery. Just because they believed it, the emotion doesn't make it factual. It was actually the exact opposite. And so that's something to keep in mind is, emotions are powerful and can really drive beliefs. Even so much that people will die for something or really sacrifice for it. But it does
We look at what they did and what they said, say something really happened. So what are you guys saying happened? And what they said happened, of course, is Jesus was raised from the dead. And then we're looking at all this as a package, because it's not just their sincere belief that proves it. Race.
The first, or the second half of Gamaliel's statement is absolutely true. This is from God, Gamaliel will stop me. The first half of Gamaliel's statement is patently false. Because the reality is there are at least two religions that I can think of immediately that are completely man-made that still have a great number of followers today and have existed for quite some time and outlived their leaders. So, I mean, his argument sounds rational, and the reality is the second statement about God is absolutely true. If this is from the true and living God, there is no stopping you. You can do whatever you want. But the first statement, we just have to understand there are people who have died for causes that are man-made. And I mean, the Islamic faith is over 1 billion people. It's man-made. And it still exists today, even after over 1,000 years, I think.
1,500
So,
something.
yeah, so I mean, we're looking at. So I mean, just I want to make sure we understand that.
Oh, yeah.
Particular point.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, Joe, go ahead.
An easy reference, and it may have been said because Jeff and I were talking about it.
Yeah, I saw that, by the way,
Yeah, sorry.
guys.
It was that, do you remember David Koresh and?
That was one of the ones I
Joe?
was thinking of earlier.
What?
Yeah.
Did somebody say that already?
No.
Oh,
No.
because they believe what he was saying is, you ever see him talking, and I think I'm talking about David Koresh. If you see him talking, how convincing he sounded like he had, how he manipulated those people, and they all just did what he said to do, and he didn't do it in a harsh, dramatic way. He was in a soft way and got them all to do it.
Yeah. That's one of the examples I was thinking of earlier that also follow that predictable pattern of, what the leader is going to say next. So let's look at one case here in particular of one of these disciples sincerely believing to the point of death. And we're looking at James, the brother of Jesus. So we already established in most cases when we're talking about James in the New Testament, unless it says otherwise, and obviously the Gospels are a little different. But in Acts and the Epistles, usually when we're talking about James, it's James, the brother of Jesus, because he was the guy in Jerusalem. He was one of the leaders of the church. Paul talks about him as being a pillar. You see later he says men were sent from James, different things. And you look closely at some of the things in Acts and it says, go tell James and the rest of the brothers, because he was a very central figure here. And he's actually one of the ones that there is a reliable historical record of his death. And you guys have already seen this before, which is one of the reasons I want to talk about it. So this is the same thing that's on your paper. There on what Josephus reported about James. Can I get a volunteer to read this paragraph, either from the paper or from the screen? I think they're the same. Make sure I get them from the same version. I think so, but we'll see. Can I have a volunteer to read this? Taylor, would you mind reading it?
When therefore Ananus was of this disposition, he thought he had now a proper opportunity to exercise his authority. Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled a Sanhedrin of judges, and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others, or some of his companions. And when he had formed an accusation against them, as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned.
Okay, so we've seen this before. And just as a recap, what's happening here is there's this political instability where another governor is coming from Rome. And so the high priest at the time says, I'm going to take advantage of this and get rid of some of our enemies. And some of those were James, the brother of Jesus, and those associated with him. And so Josephus talks about this martyrdom, essentially. And there are other sources that get into a little bit more detail, very graphic detail that I don't necessarily want to share, and their reliability is sometimes questioned. But we look at this, James had apparently, so this is the early 60s of the first century. James had been following Jesus this whole time since he believed. We talked about the fact that he did not believe in his brother when he was alive originally, but that the whole family converts and follows Jesus as Messiah. And it goes all the way 30 years later. He's still doing this. And what he is killed for here, what does it say that this man kills James for? Breakers of the law. Does that sound familiar? Of a charge against people? Yeah, because that's the same thing that the Jews were saying in the New Testament. They're breaking the law, they're throwing away our customs, they're saying not to obey Moses, all of those things. James is killed as a breaker of the law because he's following Christ. So James went from not believing in his brother to being one of his foremost followers and then dying in his name as Messiah. And I provided a quotation from someone because I could not think of a better way to say this at the bottom of page 5. What would it take for you to die for the belief that your brother is the Lord? What would it take for you to die for the belief that your brother was the Lord? It would take me a whole lot. I tell you what, sorry, Sam. Think about this. He did not believe in him. The Gospels make abundantly clear. His brothers did not believe in him. Something changes to where James becomes one of the foremost disciples, and then he pays the ultimate price in his belief, in his older brother being Lord in Christ. That says something. And everyone would agree that this is, a factual thing.
Just thinking, look at James 1:1 and Jude 1.
Oh, yeah.
And what they say, I mean, they didn't say, my brother Jesus, James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. And Jude, a servant of Jesus and a brother of James. So just the fact that they didn't play on the fact that, this is my brother, and this is the most important person in history. They didn't say that. We're servants.
Servants of him. And I cannot imagine the mental gymnastics of coming around the fact that my brother is the Son of God. And I imagine, as I said before, he was probably so frustrating when they were growing up because he never did anything wrong, and then he's making these claims, but they believed in him to the point of death. Greg, did you have your hand up?
It's just kind of a side point that there were Jewish writers, Christian writers, who really struggled with what kind of childhood would the Son of God have. And so they came up with a problem of stories of a very young Jesus performing odd miracles and doing strange things. And if James had witnessed all this as a younger brother, he might have had a little more credibility as being the Son of God than had he just been a kid growing up with extreme knowledge and wisdom that was unexplainable. It's just a side point, but there had been so much made of, well, how could the Son of God have been just a normal baby or a normal child? Or
I don't know.
It seems like he did, though.
Yeah. Okay, everyone, so we will pick up at the top of page 6 some of the things that we've already talked about, and we will set the goal of finishing this on Sunday. And ideally, Sunday, I will have the new packet for you for fact number 4. So any questions before we stop? All right, thank you.